Let me take you back to the good old days. Period 2. Period 2. Women were in charge of cooking, cleaning, and providing medical care. Go fill this for me. Also, they were in charge of educating the children.
What's 4 times 4?
60! They have limited legal and political rights. They often work next to their husbands in the shops, plantation fields, and farms. Period 4.
Go.
Period 4. Period 4.
Women reformers resented the way men reduced them to secondary roles and excluded them from policy discussions.
A pair of reformers, Mott and Stanton, began campaigning for women's rights after they were banned from speaking at an anti-slavery convention.
The leading feminists met at Seneca Falls in 1848. At the conclusion of their convention, the first women's rights convention in history, they issued a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which issued that all men and women are equal.
After the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony led the campaign for equal voting, legal, and property rights for women. In the 1850s, the issue of women's rights was overshadowed by slavery issues.
Period 5.
The Civil War brought much social change. Although every part of American society away from the battlefield was touched by the war, the most directly affected were women whose labors became more burdensome. The Civil War was the first time women had a chance at working outside of the home. The absence of millions of men from their normal occupations in factories and fields added to the responsibilities of women in all regions.
First, the field of nursing was now open to women. Previously, hospitals only employed men as doctors and nurses. Second, the enormous responsibilities undertaken by women during the war gave movement to obtain equal voting rights for women.
Period 6. 1869 to 1890.
A western state, Wyoming, was the first to grant full suffrage to women in 1869. By 1990, some states allowed women to vote in local elections, and most allowed women to own and control property after marriage. In 1890, two of the pioneer women of the 1840s, Elizabeth Cady and Susan B. Anthony of New York, helped found the National American Women's Suffrage Association to help secure the vote for women.
As the demand for clerical workers increased, women moved into fields formerly occupied mostly by men, including secretaries.
Period 7. The Progressive Era.
During the Prohibition era, alcohol was believed to be the root of many social problems. Among these problems was violence, especially against women. Prior to Prohibition, men would come home in a state of drunkenness and abuse their wives or children. Women's public, private, and political lives forever changed during the Prohibition era. Their involvement in passing the Prohibition Amendment in 1919, gaining the right to vote a year later, and their growing autonomy at home, in the workplace, and in relationships launched American women into uncharted territory. The Prohibition Amendment, prohibiting the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol, would have not been passed without the persistence of women involved in the temperance movement starting in the 19th century. The best-known women's organization favoring prohibition was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. By aligning the prohibition movement with the suffrage movement, women were able to drum up support for the women's right to vote. While the push for suffrage began in the middle of the 19th century, efforts surged forward during 1910s with the National Women's Party.
Probably the most significant change in the lives of young women in the 1920s was the revolt against sexual taboos. A special fashion that set young people apart from older generations was the flapper look. They were influenced by actresses as well as their own desires for independence. Young women shocked the elders by wearing dresses hemmed at the knees, bobbing their hair, and drinking and smoking.
Period 8. The 1960s.
The women's movement. The increased education and employment of women in the 1950s, the civil rights movement, and the sexual revolution all contributed to a renewal of the women's movement in the 1960s. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, gave the movement a new direction by encouraging middle-class women to seek fulfillment in professional careers in addition to filling the roles of wife, mother, and homemaker. In 1966, Friedan helped the National Organization for Women, NOW, which adopted the activist tactics of another civil rights movement to secure equal treatment of women, especially for job opportunities. By this time, Congress had already enacted 2 anti-discriminatory laws, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These measures prohibited discrimination in employment and compensation on the basis of gender, but had been poorly enforced.
Okay, go.
Period 9, 1980 to present.
Even today, women still face hardships in everyday life. The Me Too movement is a movement against sexual harassment and assault. This movement highlights how many women daily are victims of these crimes and helps them heal. The Roe v. Wade court decision made abortions illegal in 1973. However, today, there are many debates on whether abortions should be allowed, and women are oftentimes shamed if they choose to go through with an abortion.